great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight and to the second in this series called Foodways in Mexico. It's a terrific series that was originated I think it's the first time that LILAS has done a series like this, the Mexico Center and LILAS. And it was originated in the spirit of a whole flurry of activities of various sorts that we're sponsoring this year in recognition of the centenary and the bicentenary of the independence and centenary of the Mexican Revolution. I was just at an event earlier this afternoon. The Mexican consulate, along with the city of Austin, and LILAS has also got actually just launched a website with a whole series of events. So it's really a wonderful year in Austin to be taking in all kinds of fascinating intellectual work, research, and public speaking, artistic work on Mexico. And it's a great pleasure to have this series here. I think one of the things that's particularly important about Foodways of Mexico is that it's, as a series, it bridges scholarly work, research, with a series of very important in anthropology and history and other disciplines, with a series of topics that are very important to the broader public of great broader interest. And that's one of the things that LILAS wants to do more and more of, is have a series of intellectual programs that reach out beyond the university. So it's a great pleasure to have the Foodways series as part of that larger initiative. I also want to particularly thank Professor Brian Strauss and Claudia Alarcón, who I'm going to introduce, who's then going to introduce our speaker. Because they, along with Gail Saunders, who's the coordinator of the Mexico Center, who's here behind the corner here, but will come out and at least wave her hand, were the originators of this series. And Claudia, in particular, is an illustrious, I want to make a special point of the fact that she's an illustrious graduate of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas. And that's very important since that's also my home department. She received her BA in 1999, and she wrote an honors thesis which was on the history of tamales, which then she's now turning into a book which won a very prestigious award from the Oxford Symposium on Food History, and now she's turning it into a book-length project. And she was our first speaker in this series, which many of you perhaps attended, which was on a history of tamales. And so I want to thank Claudia again for being the inspiration and the organizing force behind this series, and turn the podium over to her to introduce our speaker tonight.
Gracias, Charlie. You're so great. Thank you, everybody, for coming again tonight to the second series, the second in a series. When Gail asked me to help her put together a list of possible lecturers on a Foodways of Mexico series, the first person I thought of was Rachel Laudan. She is not only a wonderful human being, but one of my most respected mentors, an amazing researcher. She knows everything about everything, and don't let her tell you she doesn't. A little background on her, and something I didn't really know. I knew she grew up in England, but I didn't know she grew up on an agricultural and dairy farm. So now she's kind of really sick and tired of the farm-to-table movement. She doesn't want anything to do with milking cows or planting corn. She instead focused on getting her PhD in history from the University College in London. She was a historian for a very long time and published many, many books. And eventually she moved to Hawaii, where she studied the foodways of Hawaii and wrote a fabulous book, Food of Paradise, Exploring Hawaii's Culinary History. And with that book, she won the Julia Child Jane Grigson Prize of International Association of Culinary Professionals. She also won the first prize of the Sophie Co. Award for the Oxford Symposium. I only got an honorary mention. And she decided to focus full time on food history, leave academia behind, and with her husband Larry moved to Guanajuato, Mexico in the late 90s. And that's where she resides now. She spends her time there and in Mexico City, and has a wonderful blog that you all should all Google and read her research. Today she's going to share one of my favorite topics that she has presented before, but now is refurbished and augmented. And I am very honored and thrilled that she accepted our invitation. And please help me welcome my friend and mentor, Rachel Laudan.
Thank you, Claudia. What I'd like to do today is to invite you to join me on a thought experiment, as scientists would call it, a thought experiment that takes a different tack on the history and present state of Mexican cuisine. Because I live in Mexico, when I come back to the United States, friends and acquaintances always ply me with questions. They say, now, really, what is the most authentic book on Mexican cuisine? Is it Diana Kennedy or Rick Bayless, or perhaps Marilyn Townsend or Sarela Martinez? And, what do you think is the most authentic restaurant? And I always find this question a little daunting, because I love these authors. I have learned huge amounts from their books. I have tried their recipes and found them to work extremely well. But they are written for an American audience. And so they necessarily concentrate on what is different and unique about Mexican cuisine, not what Mexican cuisine shares with the rest of the world. That means they concentrate largely on the corn kitchen of Mexico, the tamales, the tortillas, the salsas that go with them, the traditional dishes. And that's there, and it's wonderful. And before you think I don't care about the corn kitchen, because this is the last time I'm going to mention tamales and tortillas in this talk, let me assure you that it is a great interest of mine. I've spent lots of time in the last few years talking with people who make metates, grindstones, metateros. I spent a lot of time with women in villages grinding, and I hope one day to publish something on grinding and metates. But at the same time, I would like to set Mexican cuisine in a different context. Why do I want to do this? I want to do it because my big project over the last 10 years has been writing a book that will be coming out next year with the University of California Press called Cuisine and Empire, A Global History of Food and Cooking. I do it because I myself am a migrant and on my third or fourth country, depending on whether you count Hawaii as a full partner in the United States. I do it because when I am in Mexico, the experience I have of Mexican food, and many of you may have had this, is slightly askew from its presentation in the United States. So I'd like to thank the Lausanne Long Institute. I'd like to thank Charlie and Claudia and everybody else who has made it possible for me to come and try and share these ideas with you. I'd also like to thank my friends and in Mexico, both food professionals and academics in Mexico City, who do wonderful work on the history of Mexican cuisine and on its current state. And I'd like to thank the people of Mexico who have opened their kitchens to me, whether it's the group I have walked with for the last 13 years every morning, whether it is the girls who have helped me in the kitchen. All these people have made it possible for me as an outsider to get some glimpse of the rhythm of everyday life in a contemporary Mexican kitchen at different social levels. What I want to do is to talk about Mexican cuisine from the point of view of migrants. Migrants, rather loosely understood, that is, people who have migrated in and out of Mexico over the last 500 years. I'm not going to say things about how they adapt to Mexican cuisine or to living in Mexico. That in itself is interesting. It would be fun, for example, to talk about the Jewish community and their gefilte fish a la veracruzana and their bagels con guacamole. But that's not the emphasis. The emphasis is on what non-indigenous migrants into Mexico have contributed to Mexican cuisine. I'm going to go very fast. 3 snapshots: the colonial period, New Spain, the Porfiriato, and the post-revolutionary period. I'm not going to do all migrants in any of those periods. I'm just going to try to give you a taste of what I think migrants have contributed to cuisines of Mexico. So let's start with New Spain, the period roughly from the 1540s to the early 19th century. Start with this drawing that I love of the Spanish, in quotes, unloading a cuisine on the shores of Mexico under a welcoming rainbow that has connected them from the old world. You can see them bringing off their horses and their sheep and their pigs and axes to clear the ground and sacks, perhaps with seeds of wheat, and barrels. What you can't see in this picture is the books that they brought with them, the cookware that they brought with them, the know-how that they brought with them, and the ideas that they brought with them. This was to be a new Spain. This was to be a new Spain with utopian cities modeled on their understanding of that tradition from Plato to Thomas More. This was to be a country with 2 republics, a republic for the Spanish with these splendid cities, and a second republic for the indigenous with their pueblos. The reality, of course, was to be more complex. They brought with them, as I say, they were not contemporary tourists. They were not going there to explore the cuisines of the New World. They were going to take the cuisines of their own area with them. And one of the technologies they took with them was the making of fideos, or noodles, the little short noodles that Mexicans still cook as a first course, kind of pilau style, frying them and then cooking them with broth. On the left here, you can see an 18th century picture of how a fideo press works. A European picture of how a fideo press works. You put the masa in, and then you turn the screw, and the little fideos come out underneath. And on the right is a photograph of a fideo press in the Augustinian monastery founded in the 16th century in what was then the northern frontier in Uraria, in the southern part of the state of Guanajuato. It's still sitting there in the Augustinian monastery. These fideos were not a specifically Spanish dish. They were invented in Islam, and in the Mediterranean they were traded around Sicily, Sardinia, and Catalonia in particular. If you go to Catalonia today, people will still offer you this dish on Sundays, and it's exactly the same as it is in Mexico, except they use fish sauce very often. The Spanish, then, who came to Mexico, really were people from the Habsburg Empire and its surrounding nimbus of regional areas. They were Catalans and Basques and Castilians who did not have a language in common. They were Genoese, who were some of the biggest traders in fideos. There were people from the Low Countries and from Greece. There were new Christians, crypto-Jews from transiting from Spain to Portugal. There were probably crypto-Muslims. So that what is coming to New Spain is a complex from the migrants. The kitchen that they took was a Christianized version of the Islamic-inspired cuisine of Al-Andalus and the north shore of the Mediterranean. In fact, the whole of European cuisine in the Middle Ages was Islamic-inspired, with pork and lard as a touchstone that differentiated Christian cuisine from Islamic. You can see here the traditional tiles, the bench stoves that were common with the pots on. That's the stove that you still see these in Mexico, that were common to both Islam and to the Christian world, to Christendom. They were transported wholesale. This, of course, as many of you know, is the famous convent of Santa Rosa in Puebla. And there, and in all these kitchens across New Spain, people created the kitchen that was common to these areas, sweets of sugar and nuts and fruits, aguas frescas or sherbets, pilau-style rice, pilau-style fideos, couscous. Couscous continued to be made in San Luis Potosi right through the middle of the 19th century. They also created their main dishes. And of these, I think when you set it in this context, the most influential is mole poblano, which is essentially a pureed sauce based on nuts and fruits with cereal thickeners of various kinds, common across Islam and the Islamic-inspired Christian cuisines of Europe. As an assertion of Criollo difference, by the mid-18th century, when the Spaniards, quote, born in New Spain, were beginning to resent the Spaniards who came from Spain itself, the Peninsulares, they add chiles for heat in the sense of potency, humoral heat, and chocolate for cooling to balance the hot chiles. Selectively adapting from the cuisines of the indigenous, these kinds of dishes, I think, survive much longer in New Spain because they are still using the grindstone, the simple metate, which makes them much easier to prepare than they were in Europe that had abandoned the grindstone. That's by the by. These, though, are just the beginning of the migrants who came into Mexico. In 1565, galleons began making the arduous long trip between Acapulco and Manila, laden with silver and returning with silk and porcelain, and chinos and their cuisine. Chinos were people who arrived from Asia. There were something probably like, according to recent figures that I saw in an article published about a year ago, about 600 arriving a year. That may not sound like many, but it adds up. There were probably as many Chinos as there were, or close to, as there were Europeans. Because Manila was a center of trade and commerce in Southeast Asia. These included famously the China Poblana, a girl from India, but also Chinese, Japanese, Southeast Asians, and the majority of Filipinos. And they too brought things with them. Here we see a gentleman, he's brought Tuba palm wine. Tuba is the name that is common to both the Philippines and to Mexico for palm wine to Guadalajara to sell. And here you can see a plastic glass with Tuba with a few pecans on top. It's a very delicious drink, and I am trying to confirm reports that Tuba was used as much in the mines as pulque, as an invigorating, mildly intoxicating drink. They also brought tamarindo. tamarind, rice, canela, the beautiful tamarind tree with its spreading limbs and hanging pots, went in, of course, to one of the commonest aguas frescas of Mexico, the Agua de Tamarindo, which you will see on any stand anywhere in Mexico, I think. Here is the pod on the left and the making of this Agua de Tamarindo on the right, a staple in all Mexican kitchens, at least in my part of Mexico. The other big group that come in are the Africans who brought in as slaves, mainly from West Africa, and who, again, in this case, outnumber Europeans until about the time of independence. Here we see a young woman in the state of Guanajuato, in the town of Guanajuato. They've just produced a lovely book of photographs of Negros in the early 20th century in Guanajuato, and this is a lovely one of a young woman. Research is going on apace at the moment to try to figure out what came with the Africans. Obviously, their opportunities for bringing either ingredients or plants or of influencing the society were somewhat less than those of the people who move freely. I am holding out for the fact that in the very area where the free slaves and the runaway slaves gathered just south of Silao in the state of Guanajuato is also one of the few areas where I see cowpeas, black-eyed peas, being sold and used in Mexico, and they're often associated with African influence. But the picture here is of a plantain dish from Veracruz, Mogo Mogo. Plantain, plátano macho, cooking banana, certainly hails from Africa. By the time of independence, we have a complex fusion cuisine in Mexico that defies any simple description in Spanish indigenous terms of mestizaje. It has elements from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, from Mesoamerica, from different religions, and from different classes. The next, I think, really big changes in cuisine, though independence itself produces some, but when the country settles down in the Porfiriato, we see another series of striking migrant introductions to Mexican cuisine. Before Porfirio Diaz came to power in 1876, many Mexican intellectuals and the elite had decided that they wanted to opt for a modern society for their new nation, where modern was understood in terms of science, in terms of technology, in terms of European culture, in terms of liberalism and progress, all the slogans of the late 19th century. They saw France as the cultural leader in this, and England and America as the economic and technological leaders, also Germany. And as a result, they saw no irony whatsoever in sitting down to celebrate a victory over the French, not with a Mexican meal, but with a French meal, because Mexico is a modern nation, and modern nations eat French food. That's what you do as a modern nation. The elites in Mexico adopt a strongly Frenchified cuisine, though as the author of the Nuevo Cocinero Mexicano, or at least the second edition of it, this comes out in 1888. There was an earlier one in 1831. But the second one in 1838 is modeled as a dictionary on Alexandre Dumas' Dictionary of French Cuisine. It's an enormous, great big fat tome about this fat, and it's an interesting document because, as the author says, it's been necessary to Mexicanize French cuisine. So they adapt it so that tamales will jostle up against descriptions of European tortas, cakes, that is, not the sandwich. Descriptions of fideos will come next to descriptions of give me a French dish that has F as the first word, but foie gras. Okay, no, actually that's later. That doesn't work for this. But so you have a Mexicanized French cuisine. They take this very seriously. I mean, it's very necessary. It is decided that the old open-air markets, which go back to pre-Hispanic days, get brought up to modern standards. And here in Guanajuato, we have the splendid Mercado Hidalgo. It's a glass and iron structure, literally shipped in by France by the Eiffel engineering family and erected in Guanajuato, like the Opera House they erected at the same time. You need, of course, French pasteleria, and the venerable El Globo was founded in 1884, but French cuisine being what it was, there weren't enough French to spread it around the world, so this was actually opened initially by the Tenconi family. Then it was sold to another Italian family, Giovanna La Porred. And then, actually in an interesting series of twists, recently it's undergone two more changes, first being sold to, well, there were a number of owners in between, but first being sold to a Lebanese Mexican, Carlos Slim, and then being sold to Basque Mexicans, the Ceviche family who own Bimbo. In the 1880s, the combination of efficient refrigeration and scientific research into fermentation means that the Heineken company discovers how to make lager beers year-round. And in the 1890s, every town worth its salt, from northern China to Mexico, hires German or Dutch scientists and engineers to help them set up breweries. Mexico is no exception to this. It imports the technology. There are breweries set up all over Mexico. Obviously, this is one of the more successful, set up in 1893 and soon winning prizes for its Carta Blanca beer. With Germans came a taste for rye bread, which you will see on this crowded grocery store shelf here. You will find it. It was a slight puzzle to me, but you'll find it commonly in Mexican grocery stores. And chuletas ahumadas, the smoked pork chops, that were also a mystery to me when I first went to Mexico because they didn't seem to quite fit with other aspects of the cuisine. Most of the English who came to Mexico, like my 80-year-old neighbor across the street, well, it was her grandfather, came to work as engineers in the lighting companies, the railroad companies in the late 19th century, or as investors. But a lower social stratum also arrived, Cornish miners to work in the silver mines in Pachuca. And they brought with them their pasties, which look like empanadas, that transmuted into Mexican pastes. Here you can see one on a busy street in Mexico City, and the photo is taken from a cardboard box that was transporting these. I like the auténtico sabor de nuestra tradición. They have become part of the tradition. And in fact, they have the largest concession at the enormous Central del Norte, the big northern Mexico City bus station. Not this company, another pasty company. We never want to leave out the US here, which was in and out of Mexico, as is well known throughout the 19th century. The Americans brought in, again, food processing technology, the soda crackers, the saladitos, which sustain many Mexican housewives when their children come home hungry from school. You can always give them a little tuna and pico de gallo on a saladito, or a bit of mayonnaise on a saladito. But they also brought in new ideas for dishes, the sandwiches. Here is a book, I hope you can see it, that is a recipe book for sandwiches from the 1920s, and they brought in the idea of lunch, platillos para lunch. This is soon to transmute into lonche and loncherias in Mexico. There were soda fountains. This is a famous story, of course. The brothers Walter and Frank Sanborn arrived from Los Angeles in 1903 and set up Sanborns, which then went into the Walgreen family in 1948 and is still going strong. What would everybody or all the ladies who lunch in. It was a very important thing because it was the first place where respectable Mexican women could eat outside the home. It still fulfills something of that function. It's where ladies meet to lunch to this day, and I don't know what I would do without it. And this too now, of course, belongs to Carlos Slim. And then there are those indispensable global staples without which the Mexican kitchen would have a hard time surviving. Here are the big three. There is Hugo Maggie, which is a Swiss version of, or Swiss attempt to copy Chinese soy sauce, and that is marketed in every store in Mexico, from the tiniest tienda to the biggest supermarket. There is mayonesa, an American rendition of a sauce that the French claim to have invented, but was probably Spanish. And then there is salsa inglesa, which is good old Worcester sauce, an English attempt to copy Southeast Asian fish sauce. And that is, again, crucial in Mexico. So by the time of the revolution in the cities, you have a cuisine in which food processing, kitchens, meals, dishes, ingredients, places to eat out has been strongly influenced by the revolution in food that was taking place around the world in the late 19th century with the application of science and technology to food processing and food production. Its reception in the countryside is much more limited, but it is there in place in the cities, and its influence has only spread as Mexico has become more urban in recent years, and in fact, many of these things will now be found in the countryside as well as in the cities. Okay, now we jump to the period after the revolution. We'll talk about roughly the 1940s to the present. Again, there is a tension between the political vision for the country and what happened in food. As you all know, it was a time when the politicians tried a variety of intellectual and political strategies to bring the country together after the revolution. Jose Vasconcelos conceives of Mexico as having his cosmic race. The history of food becomes written as one of mestizaje, stressing the indigenous component. Intellectuals take an interest in indigenous food. The meals put on by Frida Kahlo or the cookbooks written by Adela Hernandez are part of this effort to emphasize the indigenous roots of Mexican cuisine. And in 1936, the Ley General de Población is passed. Mexicans form a single nationality with a single language, Spanish. At the same time, the entry of other migrants in the Porfiriato, Italians, Lebanese, Japanese, Chinese, a second wave of Chinese and Japanese, and so on, begins to make its way into food. I'll start with one immigrant group that is often forgotten, that is the Spanish. Because the Spanish, by this period, when they come to Mexico, are coming to a country that is perceived both by the Mexicans and by the Spanish to be a foreign country. And the Spanish want their own foods. They set up ultramarinos, the Mexican equivalent of delis for foods from overseas, and they introduced the Mexicans to the Spanish pork kitchen that had been largely forgotten in Mexico, jamón serrano, and many of the Spanish sausages. This is instrumental in the formation of the meatpacking movement, and of course it's also immigrants from Spain who set up the square bread movement ending up with, as opposed to the bolillo tradition that is, it goes back, I think, to soon after the conquest, so that you get the Basques dominating the Mexican baking industry, and then leading on, as I said earlier, into bimbo. The other immigrants are important too. Various factors, the belief that milk is nature's perfect food, the availability of refrigeration, government encouragement, leads to rapid growth in the dairy industry in the 1930s. Italian farmers in particular, there weren't very many of them, we're talking just a few hundred here, but are really instrumental in this. And Italian mozzarella that morphs into queso Oaxaca about this time. I think if there was one thing that really surprised me was how late cheese really did come to Mexico. There must have been a few quesos frescos in earlier periods, but basically all the cheese that we associate with Mexican dishes is really a product of the 1930s, and with strong Italian influence, provolone, mozzarella. Lebanese immigrants, here they are enjoying a party in the 20s or 30s, coming from the Levant, mainly Christians, some Jews, bringing with them the foods of the Ottoman Empire, including what has become Mexico's third tortilla. After the tortilla de maíz and the tortilla de harina, we now have the tortilla árabe, which you probably know better as pita bread, but which, as you can see here, the date on this is October the 21st, 2009, is baked and sold in large grocery stores across Mexico. They also brought famously the shawarma or the gyros, which turned into al pastor meats, tacos al pastor. Then there were the Chinese who came in again, and those of you who know Mexico City will know that Chinese cafes or restaurants there are associated with coffee and biscuits. The Chinese, many of them had worked on the American railroads, and they brought with them the skills they'd learned in making Mexican biscuits, and possibly hot cakes too, as well, pancakes. Biscuits are found now not only in Chinese stores, but also in bakeries and in the Biscuits Obregón, which I think is a national chain. It's certainly over all central Mexico. It was also the Chinese in this period who introduced the technology of drying shrimp to the states along the Pacific coast. And this was picked up very rapidly by Mexicans to make tortitas de camarón seco for Lent, or to make caldo de camarón as a nice pick-me-up, hangover cure, all-purpose spicy soup. The Japanese were a smaller presence, but they went into the snack business, and I would guess that most of the peanuts bought in Mexico, or a very large proportion, are the Japanese-inspired mochi-covered peanuts rather than the plain peanuts. Well, there's also the ones with chile, but mochi covers peanuts are very big. Again, should not forget the Americans, and this is an older picture of hamburguesas and hot dogs. Before the large chains get into Mexico, it is already the case that Mexican entrepreneurs are selling these street foods off their own bat. They did not need McDonald's or anyone else to teach them how to make hamburguesas and hot dogs. And of course, you can buy buns for hamburguesas and hot dogs absolutely everywhere. For my last two slides, I'd like to turn to what is now one of the most important group of migrants making changes in Mexican food, and that's Mexicans themselves, of course. Because Mexicans are highly mobile and extremely cosmopolitan now. I sometimes think they're more cosmopolitan than the United States, because I think a higher proportion of them have traveled outside their country. Here is one migrant family, Fernando on the left, in his apartment in northern Austin. his wife, Chewy, and his 4 little girls on their right. In the small village, they live in Guanajuato. And when people like Fernando return to Mexico, they bring with them a taste for things that are not available in Mexico, like nachos and fajitas and tortillas de harina, and they are highly entrepreneurial. It wasn't Fernando, but in my local tianguis in Mexico City, which is not in a smart area at all, the same year that chocolate fountains became one of those things that television ads try to sell before Christmas, sure enough, in the tianguis, a returning migrant from the United States has a chocolate fountain and is offering to all his Mexican customers frutas cubiertas de chocolate. But the kind of Mexicans that many people also forget are highly mobile are the professional classes. Here we have this group who I have been with for 13 years. They shop in San Marcos. They go on vacation to places where it's easy to experience foreign food, like Cancun and St. Petersburg and Hong Kong and London. They shed a tear and add a few more recipes when one of their offspring marries a Sicilian or a Japanese. And they are not above trying out the latest thing, cannelloni instead of fideos before the Christmas dinner. Queso Philadelphia, we went through a Queso Philadelphia period where it went into everything. And of course, their kids all like to go out to eat sushi and Italian food. Is this terrible? Is this the loss of the Mexican tradition? I don't think so. These women are fantastic cooks. None of them has a recipe book. They all come home at 3 o'clock after their time as an accountant or university professor and whip out a crema and an arroz and a guisado and a postre and some frijoles. But as one of them said to me once, when a visiting American had been lecturing them on abandoning their Mexican roots, why can't we eat spaghetti too? The Mexican culinary community at the moment, with the support of the government, is preparing a second run to UNESCO, hoping to get Mexican food declared a patrimony of humanity. And part of me is thrilled because really, I mean, tacos and tamales and the practice of rehydrating chiles to make sauces are really quite extraordinary contributions to the world of food. Mexican cuisine has a heritage as distinguished as any on the planet. It has techniques that still are not, and ingredients that are still not widely known outside Mexico, really barely even north of the border, and certainly not in the rest of the world. But these patrimonios, these herencias y tradiciones, at the same time can encapsulate a view of cuisine as unique, as outside politics and economics, as unchanging. And without mole poblano and tacos al pastor, without cheese for enchiladas and queso fundido, without agua de tamarindo, Mexican cuisine would be so much the poorer. So I want you to just leave you with this thought, that the glory of cuisines, as of other parts of human culture, is that they are turbulent and changing things. This is what gives them life. And I think it's, as well as preserving patrimony, it's worth celebrating the ingenuity and the passion that enriches cuisines, and those that eat them with new techniques, new ingredients, new dishes, and a new world of taste and flavor. Thank you very much.